fellow followers of the stars. Welcome to the March forecast for March of 2021. And it finally seems like after a whole year and a few months that we might just be coming into a normal month. Whatever normal is, I think we've lost the ability to judge normal. But we'll get into the month in just a second. I just want to make a very brief announcement. As many of you know, I am in the midst of the Foundations Level 2 course that's being taught through Astrology Hub. And even though the course has begun, you still can register and you can still take it. You can jump right in. It's basically 20 lessons over a 5-week period, but the lessons are yours forever. So you can watch them at your own pace. And if you feel like you want the level 1 first, that's still available too. For the initial foundations course, it's just www.astrologyhub.com/foundations. And if you're interested in the level 2, which I'm calling wider and deeper, you can go to astrologyhub.com/foundations2. That's the number 2. The link will be there. Okay, so on to March. Finally, the good news is that March is a pretty regular month. There are planets that change signs. All the planets are direct now, and that gives us a feeling of moving into the future. It's there's not a drag on any of the planets that are retrograde right now. But the most important thing is that there are no outer planet aspects made from one to another, meaning that between Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, there's no significant, there's no normal typical planetary aspect energy at all. And that comes after, a year of ongoing Jupiter to Pluto, Jupiter to Saturn. I mean, the energy has just been going and going and going. And now finally we're getting a little bit of a break. On top of that, the aspects that do occur this month are just, most of them are not that tough. And some of them actually resolve some of the issues from earlier on. But here's one of the things that I want to consider before we actually move to the chart. And that is that Mercury, which has now been direct for 10 days, Mercury turned direct on February 20th. But Mercury, when it turned retrograde back the end of January, it turned retrograde at 26 degrees of Aquarius, almost the end of Aquarius. And then it retrograded through February all the way back to 11 degrees of Aquarius. Then it turned direct, and now it's moving direct again. So many of you I know the concept of the shadow, and that's the space between where Mercury originally going forward turns retrograde, goes back, and then goes forward again. That area that Mercury covers 3 times, that's the shadow area. And that's the area that's activated the most. That's the area where if we have planets that are in that shadow area, those planets get hit by Mercury, or at least transited by Mercury 3 times. Once when it goes forward, once when it goes backwards, and once when it goes forward again. And this is part of the power of the retrogrades. It's not that the planet's going backwards being or appearing that way. Visually, it appears that way. But it's the fact that those planets actually then cover ground 3 times. And so when Mercury finally is free from its shadow, that's finally we're moving into new territory. Now, here's the thing. Mercury actually, having done all this in Gemini, Mercury actually moves into, Mercury did all of this in Aquarius. And Mercury actually leaves Aquarius and enters Pisces on March 15th. So a couple of days prior to that, that's when Mercury will leave its shadow, when Mercury is toward the end of Aquarius, let's say somewhere around March 13th, or give or take a day. So that's when Mercury technically leaves its shadow. However, when Mercury finally moves into Pisces, it'll feel like a new sign. But here's the thing, and this is the thing that we're going to look at in the chart in just a few minutes. And I talked a little bit about this last month because it was on the day, or actually on January 8th, a couple of days after the Capitol insurrection, that Mercury, then Mercury in Capricorn, was actually had just moved into Aquarius, and it was squaring Mars, which had just moved into Taurus. So that happened on January 8th. And Mercury square Mars is Mercury is communication, it's thinking, it's interaction, it's communication of all types. And Mercury square Mars, squares are conflict, squares are dynamic energy that demands resolution. And Mars is, of course, the planet of war. Mars is anger. Mars is passion. Mars is how we get to where we're going based upon the passions that we're feeling, based upon the strength of our convictions, if you will. So on January 8th, Mercury moving direct squared Mars. But then Mercury turned retrograde on January 10th, and I'm sorry, on February 10th. And then Mercury moving backwards squared Mars a second time, and that was on February 10th. This is retrograde Mercury backing over that square to Mars. So that's the second time. The first time was right around the days of the attack or of the insurrection at the Capitol. And then on the retrograde, that retrograde Mercury square Mars was exact on February 10th. And the 9th, 10th, and 11th, those were the days of the trial in the Senate. So what was being played? What were people watching? They were watching the film, not the film, but the video of the actual day that Mercury, or within a couple of days of Mercury squaring Mars. And so we get a sense here that these retrograde energies throw us back in time. They put us into time loops, because somehow what was going on during the Mercury square Mars on February 10th compared to the Mercury square Mars on January 8th, there's a total similar energy. Now, here's why we're talking about this. And that is in March, Mercury finally, as I said earlier, Mercury moves out of Aquarius and into Pisces on March 15th. On March 23rd, which is going to be, I think, a big day this month. We'll come back to that, because as I scan through the month, I think it's relatively tame. These days, I'm afraid to say anything like that, because everything's a bit crazy. But I think March is relatively tame. But that period of right around the 23rd, there's a bit of intense energy. But one of the things that happens on the 23rd is that Mercury moving direct makes its third and final square with Mars. And so we'll see what happens. I don't know what'll happen, but I wouldn't be surprised if something around the 22nd, 23rd, 24th bumps us back again to the impeachment trial, and then back again to the actual days of the insurrection. And there's something else that's going on right around then too that might also be a little bit of a resolution. And that is that a week after the insurrection, on the day of the actual impeachment, we had Mars squaring Saturn. Mars squaring Saturn. And on March 21st, which is the first day of spring, it's the spring equinox in the north, and of course the autumn equinox in the southern hemisphere. But on March 21st, Mars makes a trine to Saturn. Now, Mars square Saturn was totally conflictive, but Mars trine Saturn could be or might show some reorganization, restructuring with the desire to make things work. We'll see what happens, but again, that happens on the 21st, and on the 23rd we have that Mercury square Mars, which I don't think is nearly as easy, nor do I think it's about working together. And in fact, there are other aspects that day, but we'll get there. I just wanted to throw that day out right up front. because it stood out for me as I looked at the month. So let's bring up a chart and see where it goes. So here we are looking at a chart for March 1st, 2021. And as always, this is an Aries rising chart. And the aspect lines in the middle, the blue are trines and sextiles, the reds are squares in opposition, the oranges are half squares and square and a halves. And although there's no green line showing, if and when they do, they will be the 12th harmonic, there will be the quincunxes and the semi-sextiles. So what I want to note as we just look at this chart for the first day of March, we can see that there's a trine showing between Mars and Pluto. But it's important to understand that this actually has already occurred. We still might be feeling the tail energy of this intensity, of the power of this energy, but Mars at 28 degrees of Taurus is already past the trine to Pluto at 26 degrees of Capricorn. The other thing that we note here is that Saturn at 8 degrees of Aquarius is square to Uranus at 7 degrees of Taurus. But again, we note that this has already occurred, this is past, but both of these aspects are still, they're still pretty close. And although Mars moves quickly enough that it actually moves into Gemini just in a couple of days on March 3rd, we'll get there in a moment, but that Saturn square Uranus really holds for a while. And not only does it hold for a while, it actually, and I've said this before, it actually holds for the entire year. Even when they get a little bit wide to be considered to be an exact aspect, the fact of the matter is that Saturn square Uranus actually repeats 3 times. It will repeat when Saturn is retrograding. It will repeat on June 14th. And then as it moves direct, it will repeat again exactly on Christmas Eve on December 23rd. So that Saturn square Uranus, we have to start off with this because even though it's past being exact, it's the theme of the entire year of progressive versus regressive. It's forward versus backward. It's reclaim the past versus invent the future. It's Uranus, wild, crazy, breakthrough, break out, and Saturn, hold it together, conserve, pull in, and maintain the status quo. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions here because these guys change roles in a pretty interesting way, and which is Saturn and which is Uranus isn't always apparent. Nevertheless, this will remain a theme throughout the year. Now, into this, we also see that the sun is forming a half square with Pluto. And the half squares are very much like squares. They're conflictive and they can manifest as energy. Sometimes, some people say they're not as intense. When they're exact, they can actually manifest things just like a square. But the half square between the sun and Pluto on March 1st is a bit of intense energy. And we may feel that in some ways in our interpersonal relationships or even, politically. This is certainly having, something to do with the continuing or the ongoing power struggles that we have in our own lives, perhaps in our own lives being limited by laws, by pandemic, by relationships, by employers, or in the larger economic and political scene. By the third, energy really loosens up. And as we go to the third, and by the way, all of these charts and all the times that I will give you are Pacific Standard Time. So you need to add 3 hours for the East Coast of the U.S. and you need to add 8 hours for Greenwich or for British time, for Western European time. But what we're looking at now is the chart for noon, and all these charts will be noon unless I say otherwise. But this chart for noon on March 3rd is actually showing Mars at 29 degrees 49 minutes of Taurus. And that's because Mars leaves Taurus and enters Gemini at about 7:30 on March 3rd, 7:30 in the evening. So that'll be, March 4th for people in England. Um, but the thing is that Mars, as you may remember, was in Aries for over 6 months through the second half of 2020. And then it moved into Taurus, and it's been in Taurus now for about a couple of months. But on March 3rd, it'll move into Gemini, and it's moving pretty quickly because it'll move into Cancer by around April 23rd. Mars moves into Cancer. So Mars is moving right now at a pretty good clip at about 7 weeks in each sign, right around that. Mars in Gemini, though, is very different than Mars was in Taurus. It's almost more familiar to what it was in Aries, but it's different because Mars in Aries can be too much. It can be over amping because Mars is at home. It's in its domicile in Aries. In Taurus, Mars gets there, but it's plodding and it doesn't like being held back. Mars isn't thrilled about being in Taurus, but it can accomplish a lot. Mars in Gemini is kind of like it's kind of like I want to say it's like a toddler. It's all over the place. Now this is good news and bad news because when Mars moves into Gemini late on the 3rd, we might actually feel a buzz because Mars in Gemini is curious, it's creative, it's interactive, it wants to engage everywhere it goes. Now, for some people, that can be really exciting. For some people, they love that. But for other people, it's just totally distracting. And in fact, for anyone, depending upon how it's managed, it can either be exciting and opening and creative, or it can be scattered and just wasting energy. But we need to understand that as Mars moves into Gemini on March 3rd, it becomes a little bit of a different flavor, and some of the serious energy becomes a little bit less held back. This is like even though Uranus is still in Taurus and will be for another 4 years or so, um, the fact that Mars is now in Gemini is certainly drawing us into something that's newer and exciting, and it may not be real yet, and we just may be thinking about things, but it's okay. In other words, it's okay to think about things without necessarily doing them with that Mars in Gemini, because as other planets catch up to the Taurus and Gemini, we'll have time to manifest that energy. Now, the other thing that happens on March 3rd is that Venus, moving through Pisces, makes a sextile with Uranus moving through Taurus. And, about a week ago, the sun made that sextile to Uranus, and now Venus does. And this actually can be exciting. This can open up energy a bit. It attracts us to things that we've never done. It attracts us to people that are different than people we're normally attracted to. Venus, when it's sextile to Uranus, first of all, Venus loves being in Pisces. She's exalted there. But, and sextile to Uranus and Taurus, there's this willingness to break free, to break the mold in the name of love, in the name of one's values. And so March 3rd, that occurs also. But we're feeding very closely into March 4th. And you can see already on the 3rd, Mercury, now moving direct in Aquarius, is at 16 degrees of Aquarius, and Jupiter is at 17 degrees of Aquarius. And so as that Mercury continues to move forward, we can see that on the 3rd, Mercury is at 16 degrees of Aquarius and Jupiter is at 17 degrees. And then as we move this ahead one day to March 4th, we can see that both Mercury and Jupiter are at 17 degrees of Aquarius, and that Mercury-Jupiter conjunction actually occurs in the evening on March 4th. When Mercury lines up with Jupiter, we we expand Jupiter, what we're thinking, Mercury. Mercury becomes bigger ideas. We can become philosophically oriented. We become maybe overly optimistic, maybe even irrationally optimistic. But we have hope in the future. Why the future? Because Mercury and Jupiter are both in Aquarius, and they're past the degrees of Saturn. So Saturn was holding that energy back, and now that Mercury Jupiter conjunction is, it's almost like it's free for us to dream about the potential of utopia or something that is yet to come, whether it's in our near future or our technological future. I wouldn't even be surprised if there was some sort of technological breakthrough on some level that someone announces, that some big idea. Of course, these days that happens quite often. But the thing about Mercury and Jupiter together is that they are intellectually expansive. But you remember when I started, before we had the charts up, I talked about the Mercury square to Mars that was exact on January 8th and on February 10th. Well, by the same token, Mercury, when it was moving direct, went across Jupiter at an earlier degree of Aquarius. Mercury went across, it lined up with Jupiter on January 11th. Again, the, the people's minds, their thinking was like all these big ideas, wherever whatever you were thinking, ideas thinking was inflated January 11th. Then on the retrograde, Mercury conjoined Jupiter for a second time on Valentine's Day. So that was the second round of this. And now, or coming up on March 4th, we have the third and final Mercury conjunct Jupiter. And I always find it's a good exercise in your own personal lives. Go back to your, your outlook or your calendar, your reminders, whatever you have, and think about what was going on for you around January 10th, 11th, 12th, and what was going on for you around Valentine's Day, in some way relate that to what's happening now and over the next few days, and perhaps even coming to a peak on March 4th. By March 6th, we have Venus now having moved ahead again more, and it forms an exact half square with Pluto. All these half squares to Pluto are interesting because we have both the Sun making its half square to Pluto on March 1st, and then Venus making its half square to Pluto on March 6th. So there's something here about the old guard. That why old guard? Because it's Pluto in Capricorn, the structures, that which is sensible, that which holds on to the status quo, is being agitated first by the Sun and then by Venus, our values. Now let's jump ahead to March 10th, because on March 10th, there's one thing that's happening that's significant, but it actually brings up a whole series of events. And on March 10th, the Sun it conjoins Neptune, and the Sun lines up with all the outer planets once a year. And so this is its once a year lineup with Neptune. Neptune right now is moving through Pisces. It has been for about a decade and a half, and it still has about another 5 years or 6 years to go before it will move into Aries. But the Sun's lineup with Neptune is intriguing because this month, not only does the Sun line up with Neptune, Neptune being stronger than usual, perhaps because it is in its modern sign, its modern home sign. Traditionally, Jupiter was the ruler of Pisces, and perhaps Jupiter still is the ruler of Pisces, but Neptune sure feels at home in Pisces. There's a great deal of affinity there. But the thing is that the Sun lines up with Neptune, increasing our dream space, our creativity, our imagination, and even our delusions, our fantasies that can't possibly manifest, because Neptune is not bound, it's not restrained by the rules of Saturn. So on March 10th, the Sun lines up with Neptune. On March 13th, Venus lines up with Neptune. And we're going to come back to this in a minute because this is also the new moon. And so this becomes incredibly important. But then on the at the end of the month, we have Mercury moving into Pisces, whizzing through Pisces, and Mercury catching up with Neptune on March 29th. So the point of this is that there's a background fabric in March of that Pisces energy, of the dreams, of the imagination, of the visions. There's a sense that we are being pulled beyond what's possible into the realms of what we can dream. And I think it becomes important to take those dreams that are most valid and then work toward manifestation, because that's the magic of Pisces. Does no good at all just being, an hour or a day or a year of reverie unless you do something with that. This is me, the Aries, speaking, but it's the manifestation, and I think that follows. But we're being set up here in March by these conjunctions from the Sun, Venus, and Mercury, all one at a time conjoining Neptune. Also note here that on that same day, actually on the 9th and 10th, the moon moving through Aquarius is going to make contact with Saturn, restraint, Jupiter, expansion, and then Mercury, that futuristic thinking. And so we're buzzed by that moon in Aquarius. And yet, as you note, the moon is actually in its balsamic phase. We're coming into the dark. This is the dark of the moon. And as that moon continues on March 10th, March 11th, when we get to March 12th, the moon is now in Pisces, along with the sun having just made its conjunction with Neptune, Venus coming into its conjunction with Neptune, and the moon coming into its conjunction with Venus, Neptune, and the sun, meaning that we're coming into the Pisces new moon. And at 2:21 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, we have a Pisces new moon at 23 degrees Pisces, 4 minutes. This is a very magical new moon, because that new moon, not only is it in Pisces, but we also have a Venus-Neptune conjunction in Pisces. That Venus-Neptune conjunction in Pisces is applying, meaning that it is stronger, it is getting stronger, it is getting closer, and it actually is exact by 8 o'clock that evening. So it's part of the same day. It's part of that new moon energy. And on top of that, we also have this new moon at a very interesting point, because remember we talked earlier about the square between Saturn, the old, and Uranus, the new. Saturn, they follow the rules. Uranus, break the rules. This square is, even though it was exact last month, it's still, even on March 13th, it's a degree and a half. It's less than 2 degrees of orb, so it's certainly still working. The incredible thing about this new moon is that it is at the halfway point between Saturn and Uranus. In other words, the new moon is half square, semi-square to Saturn on one side, and half square or semi-square to Uranus on the other side. And so this puts that new moon in the balance point. I mean, it's the vision of Pisces actually can hold that balance point that holds both the old and the new in the same vision. And that's really what this year is about. We need to figure out how we can make these two different forces work together. And in fact, in astrology, we already have a metaphor for that, because as most of you know, Saturn in traditional astrology ruled both Capricorn and Aquarius, and it's only the moderners that gave Uranus, when it was discovered, to Aquarius. And so Saturn and Uranus are already working together, whether we know it or not. But this square can really exacerbate the energy, and I think that this new moon, what it has working for it is the vision. is the Piscean intuitive dream that can be the seed for manifestation, the seed because it's a new moon, but also that Venus-Neptune conjunction, which is about the potential beauty that can come forth from the imagination. It's almost like if you can dream it, you can make some of it become real. And so this Venus-Neptune conjunction is a bit of magic that sits right underneath or right behind the obvious part of the new moon. Now, as we move ahead, we get the next thing that is significant that I want to stop at is that on the 15th, the sun forms a sextile with Pluto. And that sextile with Pluto is also, it's about working with that power structure. Before, we had these half squares to Pluto that were difficult. And now we're going to get a run of these sextiles. Half squares 45 degrees. And those planets that made the half square to Pluto, the sun and Venus in particular, will now make the will now make the sextiles as the 45-degree angle opens to 60 degrees. So the sun made that half square to Pluto on March 1st, followed by Venus on March 6th. Now the sun makes the sextile to Pluto on March 16th, and then Venus makes the sextile to Pluto on March 18th. And so we can see right here that Venus and the sun are tracking pretty closely together, and they will for a while. But what happens is that that on the 15th, 16th, and 17th, we certainly get a buzz from those sextiles to Pluto, almost as if that which is powerful is now working on our behalf. There's something that is there's cooperation to get somewhere that we want to get to. And again, whether that occurs globally, politically, or personally, they are typically all one the same and a reflection of each other. By the way, as we get to the 17th, we have both we have Mars making a sextile with Chiron on the 17th. And there's also a bit of potential for healing. It's almost like we're getting a sense of easy energy around the 15th, 16th, 17th, in that period of time, because not only does Mars make a sextile with Chiron, offering some potential healing and some learning, some teaching. We're able to pick up things and learn things that we didn't know before. But on the 18th, we then have Venus making a sextile with Pluto. Remember, that followed the sun. And so we're getting this sense of something here is working finally. And we'll, of course, we'll see how this plays out. But notice now that the sun and Venus are getting toward the end of Pisces. When something gets towards the end of Pisces, it's not just at the end of the sign, it's at the end of the cycle. Because remember, everything begins anew at 0 degrees of Aries. That's the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere. That's the first moment of spring. It's the beginning of the zodiac. It's the start of anything. It's Aries as that energy, as the initiating energy, the beginning. That's where it all starts. So we're kind of at an area now where, with Mercury, Neptune, Venus and the sun all in Pisces, and Venus and the sun getting ready to move into Aries, it's almost like the dark of the moon, but it's not the moon. It's almost like the dark of Venus and the sun, because they're both at their end of the zodiacal cycle. And what happens, of course, is that on the vernal equinox in the northern hemisphere, the spring equinox, it occurs actually on the 20th. So just to clarify the time here, the actual new moon itself at 2:21 a.m., that was standard time. Mercury moving into Pisces on the 15th, and then the sun moving into Aries on the 20th. Both of those are in daylight saving time. So, for example, Mercury, which I know we glossed over, Mercury, I mentioned it earlier, Mercury moves into Pisces on the 15th at about 3:30 in the afternoon Pacific time. And when Mercury moves into Pisces, we might feel a softening of the energy. again, technically Mercury has been out of its shadow now for a couple of days, but once it moves into Pisces, let's back this up a couple of days. Once Mercury actually moves into Pisces, there it is at 29 Aquarius. And once it's in Pisces, technically it's been out of its shadow for a couple of days, but now we're going to feel like something's different because Mercury is going to be vibing intuitively in a water sign, emotionally in a water sign, rather than conceptually and intellectually when it was in Aquarius. But I still hold to my earlier statement that it won't be until Mercury moves through its square to Mars, because that'll be the third and final important aspect that's been repeated by this Mercury retrograde. It won't really feel like we're free from that shadow period. But on the 15th, Mercury moves into Pisces. And then on the 16th, we talked about the 16th, 17th, 18th, where we have the kind of softer energy because of the sextiles from Chiron to Saturn, Mars to Chiron. The energy just is a little bit softer there, even the sun to Pluto. And then on the 20th, and now we're back to the 20th, on the 20th, the sun moves into Aries, and that occurs at 2:37 a.m. Pacific time. But it's followed pretty quickly by in the following day by Venus moving into Aries. And so what we have here on the 20th and 21st, we have almost like a super initiation to spring, because not only does the sun move into Aries, but Venus moves into Aries right behind it. And on top of that, then Venus actually not only moves into Aries right behind the sun, but then Venus aligns with the sun on the 25th. And you can see how close they're tracking here. They've been tracking really close for days. So Venus is invisible. She's direct, which means that she's on the far side of the sun. In other words, in a chart, she'll appear as a conjunction, but in reality, you'd have to go from Earth to the sun and then keep going and going and going. And Venus is on her orbit on the other side of the sun. So Venus has a little bit of, not a little bit, Venus is invisible here. And on top of that, she's lost into the rays of the sun, but it's in Aries. There's this newness, there's this buzz of spring is happening. And spring may mean a lot of different things. It may have just nothing to do at all with the weather. I mean, it could, but it may have to do with just the feeling of entering into a new cycle in our lives. So we will see what happens around the 20th and 21st. On the 21st, we also have Mercury now moving through Pisces, picking up on a sextile to Uranus. And so the energy here again is astrologically, I would say positive, but we never know how an energy is going to play out. But on the 21st, we also have Mars making a trine to Saturn. Now, I mentioned this earlier also because it was back in January when Mars was squaring Saturn. And now the fact that Mars is trining Saturn, there could be another layer of resolution here where it comes to things that we've been working with that may have been structurally difficult, where there's been kind of people at odds with each other, whether there were ideas or feelings, where that Mars in Taurus was squaring Saturn in Aquarius. And so it was like, I can't, I won't, I have to. This push pull, yes, no, do it, don't do it. And now Mars forms a trine with Saturn, and this trine, which is exact on the 21st, is a whole different energy, because now Mars and Saturn are saying, you know what, we're in this together, and we're going to figure out how to work that gas and brake. Gas Mars, brake Saturn. We're going to figure out how to work that in a way so that we can make an even drive forward. And so I have a lot of hope around this period of time. We'll see where it goes. But it's never, even when it's good news, one of the things that astrology teaches us is that you never get one side without another. And the other side of this is that by the 23rd, we have Mercury now making a half square with Pluto, and that basically is bringing us also to Mars making a square and a half to Pluto. So I said earlier when we first began, I said that the 23rd is an interesting day. And it has some nasty energy. The nasty energy is Mars making that square and a half to Pluto, while Mercury is squaring Mars. Therefore, Mercury is making a half square to Pluto. This is basically the third and final Mercury square Mars. And yet this Mercury square Mars has a whole nother level of angst or conflict tied up with it. And this is now, we just got off of a day just a couple of days ago, and we're still feeling a bit of it when Mars was trining Saturn. This was smooth. Remember, I said the gas and brake are working. Everything is just going along fine on the 21st, or at least from an astrological point of view. And we see how these events will interplay. But by the 23rd, the gas and brake are working fine, but our but our timing belt just failed, and we're not driving anywhere. Something happens that changes the energy from the smoother energy of the mid-month to that 23rd and 24th period of time. By the 25th, we have Venus finally catching up with the sun, and that's the Venus-Sun conjunction. And then Venus will move ahead of the sun there. But we also have another player in this Venus-Sun conjunction, and that is they're both very close to Chiron, which means that both Venus and the sun will line up with Chiron. The sun lines up with Chiron on the 29th, and Venus doesn't. Oh, no, Venus does it first. Venus lines up with Chiron on the 28th. So what we have here is a really interesting possibility, again, for healing. There's a lot about March that says we're pushing into new territory, we're figuring things out, but we're also moving in a way that doesn't have quite the weight that we've had behind us. And again, we'll see how it plays out, but a Sun Venus Chiron conjunction on a personal level can be, breaking through some vulnerabilities where you felt like you could be in a situation where could be hurt, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my God, I'm being accepted, I'm being seen, there's love here, there's not, I can open up rather than close down. Now the Venus Sun certainly has that element also, and the actual the cazimi, the law, when in traditional astrology, when a planet gets close to the sun, it can be overpowered by the sun. But when it's lined up exactly with the sun, it's in the heart of the sun. And at that moment, that Venus shines through really clearly. And because both of those planets are so close to Chiron, there's that element of the healing coming through, or again, the teacher or someone who learns, because Chiron, as Chiron teaches, that means someone else actually learns. We also have on the 27th, we have the Sun and Venus making half squares with Jupiter. And now this is interesting because that also means that Chiron, which has already made that half square exactly, but there's this whole thing about how much is too much. It's not how much is enough. It's how much is too much. What can we do that might actually push too far and lead us into the realm of, I went too far, I overextended my limit, I spent too much, I overindulged, I overcommitted, whatever. And that maybe is where Chiron comes in, and we have to deal with that hurt, pain, wound, whatever. Also notice now that we're coming into the full moon, and the full moon is at 11:48 a.m. on March 28th. Now, I normally leave the aspect lines to the moon out, because the moon moves so quickly, it can change aspects many times in one day. And since we're taking a more global, outlook on the planets over the month, I tend not to pay that much attention to the moon in these reports, except around the lunations, the new moon and full moon. Obviously, the moon is important. But because on the full moon, I want us to see the exact aspects that the moon is making. Here we have the full moon. It's actually a few minutes before 12. The actual full moon itself is at 11:48. So you can see these are off by just a few minutes of arc. It doesn't matter for our purposes here. The full moon is at 8 degrees of Libra, and it's opposing the sun at 8 degrees of Aries. Now, we didn't talk a whole lot about the change of energy into Aries, but Aries is a sign that's a go-getter. It's pushing forward. But the ancient texts tell us that Aries is a barren sign. And what it means is, if you ever look at the beginning of spring, before everything starts turning green, it's like things are dry, things look dead. There's stuff happening. There's energy that's bubbling. But Aries is that first thrust forward. It's that green shoot just coming up out of the ground, but it's also what happened when the germination occurred, but we can't yet see it. So the full moon in Libra is very much representative of the basic polarity in life in general, because the basic polarity, whether it's yin yang, male, female, in, out, up, down, good, evil, whatever opposites you choose to pick, those opposites in astrology are represented by what we call polarity. And the primal pole in astrology is Aries to Libra, because Libra is the halfway sign. It's the reflection point in the cycle. And so the full moon in Libra is reflecting the Aries, the I, me, mine, self-interest. Now, self-interest is not always bad, because if you're in my family, if you're in my tribe, if you're in my nation, if you're on my planet, and my self-interest is to fix any of those things, well, then you benefit from it. So it's not like, we have to be careful when we think of Aries as self-interest, because it's not quite the same as selfish. I mean, in that connotation, and yet Aries is, the universe is within me, and so therefore everything is me. Libra is, I'm just a drop, and the universe is unfathomably large out there. As compared to Rumi's, we are not a drop in the universe. We contain the universe within us in a drop, if you will. But this full moon that always represents the issue of relationship. And when I say relationship, I don't mean romantic or love or marriage necessarily. I mean any relationship between any two people, any two ideas, any two things. There's always a relationship established. And that Aries opposition to the Libra says, I'm aware of what the other side, the other world, the other person thinks or feels. This is what I feel. How do we find a fulcrum where we can balance the two of them? That's the Libra full moon, wanting to balance those energies. But the interesting thing about this full moon is that the sun and Venus and Chiron are conjunct. And so our feelings, looking to try to find balance, are actually in great stress or tension, as this tug of war between whose interest is the right interest, who's going to win this tug of war, which would normally be difficult at best. And I have to say, it's made even I want to say it's made even a little more difficult by the fact that the moon is also partile, 8 degrees quincunx to Uranus. And this has been a theme for us over this last year. And with Uranus still squaring, Saturn still squaring Uranus, that moon quincunxing Uranus is like, something doesn't work about jerking, moving too fast, about the erratic. Uranus happens like lightning. Something happens spasmodically or suddenly. That's Uranian energy. And that energy right now is at odds with the Libra full moon that wants things balanced. But here's the other piece of the puzzle. And that is that the full moon is actually forming a grand air trine. And that grand air trine is with Saturn in Aquarius, with the North Node conjunct Mars. Remember, Mars also has just come over the nodal axis. So we're getting an extra bump of intensity of karma, if you will, here. And the moon, just a few hours after the full moon, actually makes those exact trines with Saturn and then with the North Node and Mars. this is an incredible blessing that gives us the ability to use our intellectual language, our communication skills to in some way make it okay. And I say make it okay, I don't mean gloss over it. I mean to give things some integrity. Uh, Technically, this would be a kite, even though this little leg here is not showing because it is a bit wide to be exact. But if we back this up a few days, we will see here that leg of that coming in there. You can see how those planets were sextiling first the node, and then they will also move into that sextile with Mars over the days afterwards. There we go again. So we can see that piece of that sextile between the Aries planets and the node and Mars. But if we now back up to the full moon itself, that we can see that we have a grand trine with the moon at one point of the trine that is opposite the sun. And this kind of quasi almost kite kind of an energy indicates that there is a self-sufficiency in thinking. Trines, the energy goes around. Traditionally, trines are good, squares are bad. Anyone who's either studied with me or has observed astrology knows that's bullshit. That trines can indicate where we're stuck and where we can't break out of because the energy flows so easily. They can be patterns that are really, really difficult to break out of. Now, if they're good patterns, that's wonderful. Squares, which can be stressful, often are the motivating factor for people to do amazing things. That's what energizes, one of the things that energizes a chart. So here we have this grand air trine that's kind of like superconductive energy running around from Gemini to Libra to Aquarius to Gemini to Libra to Aquarius. This is mental, intellectual thinking, finding balance, connecting points, trying to globalize. I don't mean that politically, to generalize, to conceptualize. Conceptualize is a good word for Aquarius. All that energy is going on, and yet the sun and Chiron and Venus opposite the moon give us a way to break out of that rut, because grand trines certainly can be ruts. So we'll see what happens here. And I think that this will be a very interesting full moon. By the way, as the month draws to an end, we have that Mercury making its conjunction with Neptune, which I talked about earlier when we talked about the sun making a conjunction with Neptune on March 10th, and then Venus making a conjunction with Neptune on March 13th, and now Mercury making its conjunction. And this is basically that hope and that fantasy and those dreams that are all basically still playing quite loudly and kind of stick with us throughout the month. I want to take the aspect lines from the moon off again as we move forward toward the last day of the month, last days of the month, because not only is Mercury conjoining Neptune, but we also have an interesting dance the last couple of days of the month, because Venus makes a sextile with Saturn. Venus now moving through Aries, that will be followed by the sun's sextile to Saturn on the 31st. So Venus sextile Saturn on the 30th, and then and then the sun sextile Saturn on the 31st. This is a time of putting things back in balance. This is a time of working with what our values are, Venus. It's a time of making solid investments, whether it's financial or intellectual or relationship wise. This energy is, I think, really grounding and really solid and may really come in handy. Now, one little tweak in all of that is that on the same day, on March 31st, the last day of the month, we have Mercury making a half square with Uranus. And let's move that ahead one more day. And there's this Mercury half square to Uranus. And that can be intellectually exciting, or it can be a little bit erratic, or we can have crazy ideas, or someone else can have a crazy idea and try to enforce it. But these are not huge things. I think all in all, March is intriguing for a refreshing reason. we've had a year, actually a year and a couple of months, that is a year that no one has ever experienced before. From the January um, from the January alignment of Saturn and Pluto and the first cases of COVID-19, through the incredible explosion of human rights and activism around racial issues, systemic racial issues, and a presidential campaign that had its own level of intensity and craziness, and that culminated in an election that this country has never seen before, and that the energy, even though the election is overdone, past, the energy is still hanging from this, how far it was bent out of shape last year. And as I said, back in January, that January and February would still have a lot of residual energy from 2020, that as we move through the year, there'll be part of it, the energy that'll deepen in the Saturn square Uranus, but it won't be so much day by day. It'll just be it'll be deeper energy that'll have to work its way through over the next year, year and a half, for sure. But I think March is unique in recent months because there isn't an overrun of retrograde planets. There isn't an intensity of hard energy between Mercury, Venus, Mars to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. The energy is relatively tame. Now, will the month play out that way? That remains to be seen, and that's part of the mystery and the beauty of astrology. We never know. But there is something different going on now, and that is that we have a lot of things we can bite into this month and actually make something happen from, so that we can move on into the future and hopefully make this world a better place for all of us. Because let's face it, I don't care what you think, what you believe. I don't care what kind of views you have on pretty much anything. Most of us, maybe all of us, just want a better world, want a world where we can live in to be happier. And so from that standpoint, I think March presents the potential for that. And whether or not we make use of it, well, that remains to be seen. On the other hand, I'm cool with having that opportunity. I'm ready for it, and I hope you are too. That's it. Think cosmically, act locally. I'm Rick Levine.